We're less than a month away from the release of AMD's new Zen 5-based Ryzen 9000 series, so it's time we updated all of our CPU data in preparation for their arrival. That's exactly what I've spent most of the past few weeks doing. But rather than wait another month to reveal all of the data that I've gathered, let's recap how the current generations played out. But before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Ice Whale and their new Zima Blade single board server, their most compact server yet at roughly the size of a credit card, though you won't need much credit to buy it, as the full Zima Blade 7700 NAS kit costs just $160. This kit allows you to build a sleek x86 2-bay NAS that's compatible with TrueNAS, OMV and CasaOS. You can use it for media and entertainment, or as a smart home server, or even a compact cluster setup. Additionally, you can also upgrade its capabilities via a PCIe x4 slot, adding a GPU or perhaps more storage, for example. It's a fantastic low-powered home server with loads of potential, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so as it stands, we have 3 active CPU platforms. Intel's LGA 1700 supporting their 12th, 13th and 14th gen series, along with AMD's AM4 and AM5 platforms. Now, you can still technically buy LGA 1200 motherboards, which support the Intel 10th and 11th gen core series, but only 11th gen CPUs are still on sale, and they kind of suck. They're really only viable options for someone already on the platform with maybe a Core i3 processor, but other than that, LGA 1200 is very dead. In a sense, AMD's AM4 platform's also dead for new system builders, as you're far better off jumping on the newer AM5 platform, and we will explore that a little bit later on in the video. But what's really keeping AM4 alive is good availability of new motherboards, and there's loads of Ryzen 5000 series processors to pick from. But in reality, this is really only good news for those of you who have previously invested in the AM4 platform with an older processor and are looking for a cost-effective or at least quick and easy upgrade. As it stands though, the platform's still viable, and we do have Ryzen processors dating back to late 2020 that are still on sale, while the oldest viable options from Intel are their 12th gen series, and that was released in late 2021. So, how do they all compare in mid-2024 in the latest games? Well, today we're going to look at exactly that, along with a few different takes on the cost per frame analysis, and this data will be based on a 13-game average. Some of these games are new additions, and others we've overhauled the testing with new test locations or quality settings, which we believe to be more CPU demanding. Also, please note that while we will be including the data for 17 different CPUs and all of the individual game graphs, we do have data for over 30 models, but for simplicity's sake, I've narrowed down the amount of CPUs that we'll include in the bulk of the graphs. This just makes them much easier to read and follow what we're talking about. For example, you don't need the 5600X and 5600 in the same graph. They're the same CPU with a mere 5% boost clock discrepancy. And the same also applies to parts such as the 5700X 3D and 5800X 3D. We're going to use the more commonly sold 5800X 3D, even though we believe the 5700X 3D to be better value if available in your region. But in terms of performance, they're basically the same thing. Also, as usual, all CPU gaming benchmarks will be conducted at the 1080p resolution using the GeForce RTX 4090. And if you believe yourself to be a PC enthusiast but don't understand why reviewers test this way, please don't take to the comments section to vent your frustration. Rather, check out the videos linked in the description, which explain the very basics of CPU benchmarking and why things are done the way they are. Okay, so I'm sure I won't see the "why are you benchmarking at 1080p? No one uses that resolution anymore" comments in the comment section below. So let's get into the graphs. First up, we have Baldur's Gate 3, which has been tested at the city of Baldur's Gate. Here, the 7800X 3D is the fastest CPU tested, beating the 7950X 3D by a mere 5%, and the 14900K by 7%. The 7900X 3D and 14700K are fairly neck and neck, and the 14600K stands out as a particularly good value option here, which bodes well for the 13600K, which we'll look at a bit later on in this video. AMD's non-3D V-Cache Zen 4 parts better compete with Intel's 12th gen series, the 7700X for example, and 12900K. They're very similar in terms of performance, while the 7600X was able to match the 12700K. Now, the uber popular 5800X 3D is found delivering similar performance to the Ryzen 5 7600X, which has become pretty commonplace, and this means the standard Zen 3 parts are quite slow comparatively and fail to keep 1% lows over 60 FPS. So as cheap as a part like the 5600X is, for new system builders, I believe it's worth paying the premium for something like a Ryzen 5 7600X or 7600, as this will typically enable 5800X 3D-like performance. Next up, we have The Last of Us Part 1, and here the 14900K, 7950X 3D, 7800X 3D, and 7950X all delivered comparable performance, though the 1% lows of the Zen 4 parts were slightly stronger. Looking at the slowest Zen 4 processor tested here, so the 7600X, right up to the 1400K, we're seeing a 14% performance difference, so the grouping is pretty tight in this one. The FPS performance does start to drop away with the 5800X 3D, which is 7% slower than the 7600X in this example, though it was 22% faster than the 5800X. The 7800X 3D shines bright in Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, beating the 14900K by a 7% margin, and due to scheduling issues it was 14% faster than the 7950X 3D. Interestingly, the Intel 14th Gen CPUs all delivered comparable performance, and again, AMD's non-3D V-Cache processors were a better match for Intel's 12th generation series. Also, this time the 5800X 3D was able to nudge ahead of the 7600X, making it 27% faster than the standard 5800X. Moving on to Hogwarts Legacy, we find the Zen 4 X3D parts dominating the top spots on our graph, with the 14th Gen K-SKU parts trailing closely behind, though they do drop off for the 1% lows. The 7800X 3D, for example, was 15% faster than the 14900K when comparing 1% lows in our test. We also have another example where the Ryzen 5 7600X is a good bit faster than the 5800X 3D, this time boosting the average frame rate by 13% and the 1% lows by 20%. The 5800X 3D was still 19% faster than the standard 5800X, and we also saw that the 7800X 3D was 22% faster than the 7700X. Next up, we have ACC, and this test is dominated by the 7800X 3D, and while we should see similar performance from the 7950X 3D and 7900X 3D, those parts suffer due to scheduling issues with the dual CCD design. The biggest issue here for the dual CCD models is the hit to the 1% lows, which makes them worse than parts such as the 14900K and 14700K, though thankfully the 7800X 3D doesn't suffer the same issue. The 5800X 3D is also very impressive in this title, easily beating the Ryzen 5 7600X by a massive 19% margin. Again, the standard Zen 4 parts match up well with Intel's 12th gen series, and even Zen 3 doesn't do too poorly. Spider-Man Remastered saw the biggest FPS numbers when paired with the Core i9 14900K, though the Core i9 part was only a whisker faster than the 7950X 3D and 7900X 3D. The 14700K also does well and wasn't a great deal slower than the 7800X 3D. Interestingly though, when looking at the Zen 4 non-3D V-Cache parts, we see quite a big difference in performance between the single and dual CCD models. For example, the 7950X, that was 20% faster than the 7700X, making the 7600X and 7700X comparable to the 12th gen Core i5 and i7 parts, along with the 5800X 3D. For testing Homeworld 3, we are using the built-in benchmark, as it's the most accurate way to replicate an intense battle, so we'll stick with it for now. As the battle ramps up, the frame time consistencies do become a problem, and no CPU is really able to overcome this, with the best 1% low result being around 30 FPS, and this was achieved by half a dozen of the CPUs tested. The 7800X 3D was the fastest overall, and interestingly, while the 14900K produced a strong average frame rate, the 1% lows of all the Intel CPUs were down in this test. The 5800X 3D was also impressive, matching the Ryzen 7 7700X. A Plague Tale Requiem played best with the 7800X 3D, and again we have another example where the 1% lows are weaker than expected for the Intel processors, particularly the 14th gen series. For example, the 7800X 3D was 35% faster here when comparing the 1% lows, but just 14% faster for the average frame rate. The 7950X 3D and 7900X 3D, on the other hand, they were pretty disappointing, again suffering due to a scheduling issue with the dual CCD design. Here we see that the 7800X 3D pulls ahead in our Counter-Strike 2 benchmark, beating the 14900K by a 16% margin with 28% stronger 1% lows. The 7950X 3D and 7900X 3D also produced strong 1% lows, though again due to scheduling issues were slower than the 7800X 3D. Most of the non-3D Vcache Zen 4 parts were comparable to Intel's 14th gen series, while the 5800X 3D was 17% slower than the 7800X 3D, but 14% faster than the standard 5800X. The 14900K is able to take out top spot in our Starfield benchmark, beating the 7800X 3D by a mere 3% margin, though it was 10% slower when comparing the 1% lows. Meanwhile, the dual CCD X3D parts again suffered scheduling issues in this title. The 14600K and 7700X were neck and neck, while the 7600X was 9% faster than the 5800X 3D. Horizon Forbidden West plays well on a range of CPUs, and while the 7800X 3D, 7950X 3D, and 7900X 3D delivered some of the best results, the 14900K was also up there. Oddly, the standard 7950X does beat the 14900K, and is just 3% slower than the 7800X 3D. And we see that the 7800X 3D is also just 15% faster than the standard 7700X. So the 3D Vcache doesn't help that much in this example, and we also see that the 5800X 3D is slightly slower than the 7600X. Hitman 3 is an older game, but it's still quite CPU demanding, though all CPUs tested here pumped out well over 140 FPS. The 14th gen core parts do well. The 14900K was 7% faster than the 7800X 3D on average, though the 1% lows were just 3% higher. The 5800X 3D also struggles here as the 7600X was 19% faster. Finally, we have Watch Dogs Legion, and this game has always played best on the 7800X 3D, and we see that that's still the case here, offering 8% better performance than the 14900K. The 7900X 3D was on par with the 14700K, and the 7700X matched the 14600K. Also, this time the 5800X 3D was 7% faster than the 7600X, suggesting that this title does respond well to that 3D Vcache. Now here's a look at the 13 game average, and no surprises here, the 7800X 3D comes out on top, offering 8% greater performance than the 14900K, with a 15% improvement to the 1% lows. It was also 19% faster than the standard 7700X, so a good uplift there from that 3D Vcache. The 14700K and 7900X 3D were neck and neck, as was the 14600K and 7700X. The 5800X 3D and 7600X were also similar, with the newer Zen 4 part offering just a 4% boost on average. And then we see that the 5800X 3D was also 24% faster than the standard 5800X. Now, historically, we found that the 5800X 3D and Core i9-12900K are neck and neck. But using more recently released games, we find the Core i9 processor is now 7% faster on average. Not a massive margin, but it seems as though the higher bandwidth DDR5 memory is starting to play a role for this matchup. Okay, so let's add in all the relevant CPUs currently on the market for a cost per frame comparison. Please note though that I haven't added the Ryzen 8000 series, as I don't believe those APUs make sense when paired with a discrete graphics card, and the AMD non-X parts that haven't been included have been omitted as the current pricing makes no sense, and the same applies to certain KF series Intel processors and even some non-K models. So at least based on US pricing and availability, this is what we're left with. The outright best value CPU is still the Ryzen 5 5600X, which explains why it outsold every other product SKU. That said, Intel's Core i5 12600K is also exceptionally good value, and I think had the LJ 1700 platform had some legs in it, as in it was supported beyond just a single generation, because let's be honest, 14th gen wasn't a new generation, it was just a refresh, then I think it had the potential to be a lot more successful than it ultimately was. Then we find the Ryzen 5 7600 and 7600X, which have really improved in terms of value over time. It's crazy to think that the 7600X started at $300 US. That was a pretty ugly price for that part, and I'm so glad to see it now down at $200 US with the non-X model at $190 US. That's also a great buy, and really these are the best value parts on this list in my opinion. Now, although the Ryzen 7 5700X 3D also looks to be great value, this part really only makes sense for someone who has already invested in the AM4 platform and is looking to squeeze a bit more life out of their existing motherboard and memory combo. So the 5700X 3D might be a great option for those already on AM4, but for everyone else, you should just skip it in favor of the Ryzen 5 7600 or perhaps a better AM5 processor. This also means, despite costing $175 US, the Ryzen 7 5800X should also be avoided by new system builders, as should the 5700X at $165, and you really should avoid the dodgy 5700 at $170, as it only packs a 16MB L3 cache due to it being a Zen 3 based APU with the iGPU disabled. Super dodgy naming there by AMD. Moving on, like the 12600K, the 13600K, and KF are great value parts, and are certainly viable alternatives to competing Zen 4 products. You are paying around a 13% premium over the Ryzen 5 7600, but for those also interested in productivity, the Core i5 is up to 50% faster, so it's a much better value all-rounder. But again, I think it's Intel's limited platform support that had buyers wary of investing in LGA 1700, not necessarily the CPUs themselves. Of course, the undisputed king of gaming right now is the 7800X 3D, and while the 7950X 3D can technically be faster, you either have to disable the non-3D Vcache CCD or use software to manually assign tasks to a certain CCD. So it's a bit of a messy solution. Still, for gaming, the $340 US price tag of the 7800X 3D, it just cannot be beaten, resulting in a cost per frame of just $1.88 in our testing, which is a 40% saving when compared to the 14900K. In terms of cost per frame, the 7800X 3D is more comparable with the Core i5 14600K than it is the Core i9. So for gaming, you need not look past the 7800X 3D, certainly when it comes to value, and everything else below it on this graph is rather poor in terms of value, at least comparatively. Many of these CPUs only make sense if you want to game and work, but at that point AMD does have the market pretty well cornered with the 7950X 3D at $500 US. It's not a perfect solution, but at that price it is still unbeatable. Now, it's worth noting that Zen 4 wasn't always great value. In fact, the launch pricing just wasn't good at all, and I suspect we might see a similar thing with the upcoming Zen 5 processors. So this graph here includes the current and previous generation models based on the MSRP. So that means the 7600X, for example, has been priced at $300 US. At that price, the new 14600K is actually better value in terms of cost per frame, while the 13600K is equal to the Ryzen 5 processor. The Core i7 14700K is also on par with the 7800X 3D for value, at least when it comes to gaming. Then we see that the Ryzen 9 processors are actually much worse in terms of value when compared to the 14900K. This is why I wasn't that impressed initially with the Zen 4 processors, because the launch prices were very bad. The 7600X, 7700X, 7900X, and 7950X, they just weren't impressive. And making matters even worse at the time was poor AM5 motherboard pricing and of course DDR5 memory pricing. But as we've often seen in the past from AMD, and was certainly the case here, they do generally reduce pricing, and quite substantially. If we look at the MSRP versus current retail pricing, we see some significant changes in how AMD and Intel processors compare in terms of value. Upon release, the 7600X was only able to match the value of the 13600K and 14600K, but today it's 18% better value than the 13600K and 30% better value than the 14600K, and this is a really good indicator of why Intel's 14th generation CPUs just haven't been selling. We also see that the Ryzen 7 7700X only matched the value of the 13700K and 14700K upon release. And while it might now only be a few percent better value than the 13700K, it's 20% better value than the 14700K. The Ryzen 9 7900X matched the value of the 13900K at MSRP, but today it's 12% better. The 7950X was also 24% more expensive per frame at launch, whereas today it's just 14% more expensive and slightly better value than the 14900K. Point is, over time Ryzen has become much more competitive and therefore more attractive to buyers through aggressive price cuts. Intel shaved just $50 off the 14900K, while the 7950X 3D pricing has been axed by 4 times as much. This is one of the many problems Intel faces today. They're by no means in a dominant position, and yet for many of these matchups they're charging more money. In some examples, a lot more money. In reality, Intel should be selling their CPUs for a lot less, and this is because in many ways they're inferior. Although we haven't looked at it specifically in this video, power consumption is a major concern for LGA 1700 processors, as they use significantly more power than competing Zen 4 processors, making them more difficult to cool and much better at warming up your room. There's also the ongoing stability concerns, which has turned into a bit of a disaster for Intel, and sadly we're still unsure as to what's going on there, so I won't spend too much time on it here, other than to note that, yeah, look, stability issues, particularly for the expensive Core i9 parts, is an ongoing issue. But the biggest issue for the LGA 1700 platform as a whole is compatibility. Upcoming Arrow Lake CPUs, which will be released later this year, aren't supported and will require a brand new motherboard, meaning if you purchased a 12th, 13th or 14th generation processor and wish to upgrade to the upcoming 15th generation, you'll basically need to start over. However, this won't be the case for Zen 4 owners, as AM5 will support Zen 5, and it seems almost certain at this point that the same will be true for Zen 6. It was a smart move for AMD to announce AM5 support extending to 2027 and beyond. The question now is, how will Intel respond? Will they do the Intel thing, which is to pretend your competition doesn't exist and aren't beating you, and therefore you continue to do more of the same? Or will they finally make the necessary adjustments and announce extended platform support for more than 2 generations, and I suppose a refresh? Only time will tell on that one, but I really hope Intel comes out swinging later this year because we really need some serious competition from them to keep moving things forward on the CPU front. It's certainly at risk of becoming a bit stale. And that is going to do it for this updated look at the current and previous generation AMD and Intel CPUs. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. Also, don't forget to subscribe because we will be covering more CPUs later this month. As I said, those new Zen 5 CPUs are expected. Other than that, we have Floatplane at Patreon. Check out those if you're interested. You'll get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, Q&A stuff, a lot of cool things there. So check that out if you're interested. If not, that is perfectly fine. And of course, I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.